What's up, folks? Welcome back to the Best Show Ever podcast, the podcast where I interview folks about the best shows they've ever seen in their lives. I'm your host, Cam Hurt, and welcome to the grand finale of season 3. This is the final episode of season 3. If you're just jumping on right now, there's been a bunch of great episodes that have come out over the last month with some really, really great folks. Fantastic stories have been told. But this week is a great week for Deadheads. If you are a Deadhead, old or young, these two episodes that we have out this week are truly fantastic storytelling within the Grateful Dead world. One of those being with poster artist Danny Evans from This Old Engine. That's out right now. It also just came out. He kind of talks about the more modern days of the Grateful Dead, seeing Further and Dead and Co. and Fare Thee Well and things like that. But this episode is with, Deadhead legend and best-selling author Steve Silberman. Super lucky to have Steve on. You may know Steve from the liner note essays that he's done for many a Dead box set, many Grateful Dead box sets. Also Crosby, Stills and Nash and Young box sets as well, but also you may know him from his appearance on the Long Strange Trip documentary. You also may know him from the best-selling book that he had, NeuroTribes, which is the legacy of autism and the future of neurodiversity. This conversation with Steve is so I'm so lucky to have talked to him, because talking with Steve about live music is like, it's like taking a peek into a time of live music that I know that I wish I could visit. I know that so many folks wish that they could revisit. And his accounts of attending, the Super Jam at Watkins Glen, seeing the Shea Stadium Festival for Peace with Janis Joplin and Miles Davis, seeing the peak of the presentation of Talking Heads. It's an incredible episode with incredible stories of historic live music events, and no one could possibly tell these stories better than Steve. And so I'm really excited for folks to hear this one. If you've been listening to the podcast, thank you so much for listening. If you've subscribed to our YouTube channel, if you've rated us on the Apple Podcast or Spotify, thank you so much. All of that stuff has really helped reach a lot more folks in this season, and I can't thank you enough. And if you've done the extra step and you've donated to the Patreon and become a Patreon member, thank you so much. I hope you've been enjoying the bonus episodes that we throw on there, just having a little extra fun every week. And I hope you've been enjoying getting these episodes a day before everyone else, with your fancy pants $4 membership. Truly, folks, like, that has made the show happen. It's made it run. It's made a third season happen at all. Thank you guys so much for listening. I really hope that you enjoy this just treat of an episode to end off season 3, and season 4 will be coming soon. Let me get a couple interviews in first, but listen to this interview first. Sit back, relax, enjoy this conversation that I had with Steve Silberman. But first, here's a little bit of music from season 3 guest himself, Cal Kehoe. The song's called Down. What has been up recently? What have you been?
What has been up
recently?
The thing that's been up for your audience that would probably interest them is that I wrote like an epic length essay for an upcoming Grateful Dead box set. It's going to be more than a dozen CDs. At least one of the shows of many in the package is one of the best shows they ever played in their entire career. And it was a complicated assignment for me, because the box set sort of covers the whole tour, and the first couple of gigs are not that good, if you ask me. But so I had to sort of, ease my way into that. But by the end of the tour, everybody was having a blast. And I can't say exactly which tour it was, because that would be breaking the rules. But I will say this: the set structure of Drums in Space was invented during this period. So I get way into, like Mickey's meeting with Francis Ford Coppola for Apocalypse Now, and how that
Yeah.
influenced the development of drums in space. And I'm a type of deadhead that would not hit the bathrooms or the beer stands when Drums in Space came on. That was one of my favorite parts of the show. And even when, in the very last years when Jerry was not doing well and the shows on the whole were not that inspiring, the Drums in Space were super good, as they still are with Dead and Company now. So it was really exciting to just dig into the history of Drums in Space and how that happened. And then, the other thing I'm working on is I am a medical historian in my day job. And so
Yeah.
I wrote a book about autism called NeuroTribes that became a
Mm-hmm.
bestseller in 2015. And
Mm-hmm.
what I've been working on since then, so like 10 years now, somewhat delayed because of the COVID pandemic, is a history of cystic fibrosis, which is a
Hmm.
rare genetic disease that was universally fatal and fatal in youth until a series of breakthroughs have extended the lives of those patients. And one of my best friends has cystic fibrosis. And the moment that inspired me to write this book was realizing that if he had been born like 10 years earlier or whatever, I never would have met him. He would have died as a
Yeah.
teenager. And so the whole existence of our friendship was made possible by the breakthroughs that I'm writing about in this next book, which is going to be called The Taste of Salt. So that'll probably be out in a couple of years. But yeah, and I'm living here with my husband in San Francisco, and I guess we're making Martha Ann Alito mad because we're happy gay people, happy married gay people. But yeah, that's what I'm doing.
Incredible. Well, I mean, I'm sure, first of all, I'm sure there are about 100 deadheads that are listening to this right now that knew exactly the year as soon as you said.
Right, I'm sure they did.
They're like,
right?
got it.
But let's not talk about it. But anyway, yeah. But yeah, it was
Um,
fun, and I got to listen to many shows, and really appreciate how they would, even if they had done something really great with like Scarlet Fire the night before, like the next time they played it would be really different, as if they were intentionally subverting their own successes in a sense
yeah.
to try to get to a new place, which is great, and why
And they
we
had
kept going.
I was going to say they had a knack for doing that, which seemed to
Yeah.
be the formula then, which is cool. I can't wait to dig into that more with you. And I have not read NeuroTribes, but I did get to, read a bunch of your research and watch your TED Talk on your research on autism. And so this next book is probably going to be just as groundbreaking as that one, because the stories surrounding it, and like you said, some of these children who were born in the beginning of this research, had they been born 20 years later, would have had much different lives in the world of autism, just because people were digging into research that happened 30 years before. And so sounds like it's a similar case for what's coming next for you.
And in a sense, what might be relevant to this podcast is that I've written 2 books. I published 2 books. One of them is NeuroTribes, and the other is a book that came out in 1993 called Skeleton Key: A Dictionary for Deadheads. And that was a book that I co-wrote with a guy named David Schenk. And it was really a very in-depth, almost field anthropology of the Deadhead community. One of the things that David and I have told each other since Jerry died was that we ended up taking like the most elaborate class picture in what turned out to be the last years of the school, in a sense.
Yeah.
I mean, I knew, I'm a Buddhist, so I always have a profound sense of things passing and being, impermanent. So, I knew that the dead community would somehow disperse while I was writing Skeleton Key, but we didn't realize it was going to happen, that we didn't realize Jerry was going to die. So,
Right.
the thread that both of my books have in common are communities that are widely misunderstood that found each other, in a sense. In the sense of Deadheads, it's, everybody thinking that we were weird and spaced out, patchouli scented, whatever. In the case of autistic people, the diagnosis wasn't even available to adults until the 1990s, really. So it's like when we say, like, something that almost everybody forgets that's in my book, NeuroTribes, is that when Dustin Hoffman played an autistic adult in Rain Man, that was the first time that even many autism clinicians had seen an autistic adult on the screen. Like, that was a new concept.
Right.
And so with cystic fibrosis, what enabled this community of now adults with cystic fibrosis to find each other was this series of medical advancements, and that community would never have existed without those advancements. So in a sense, I write about communities that have fascinating histories, that are widely misunderstood, that are hampered by stereotypes, because people with cystic fibrosis, they cough a lot. And so now in the COVID era, like if they go somewhere and they're coughing, it's like, oh, and they
Not
don't,
great.
Right, not great. And people don't realize that the people coughing are the most vulnerable because they have cystic fibrosis. So, so anyway, so there are a lot of societal implications about these misunderstood, freaky, interesting communities that I write about. And so that's why I get into it.
It's such a fascinating thread to have pulled through all three of those communities. That's wild. And I would love to talk about that all day with you, but that unfortunately is not what this podcast is about.
Exactly. Yes.
the podcast is about the shows that you've attended. And I am so excited to get into yours. Before we get into your best shows and your honorable mentions and all of that kind of stuff, what's the first concert you ever saw in your life?
Oh, wow. Well, the first concert that I ever saw, let me preface this by saying, if you haven't heard of this concert, you're not even going to believe that it happened. And there have been so many times when I've told people that this was my first concert, and they're like, that never happened, until they check Wikipedia. And there is, thank God, a Wikipedia entry, but it was called the Shea Stadium Festival for Peace on August 6th, 1970. Let me tell you who played at that festival. Janis Joplin. It was her second to last gig, and even more poignantly, she was playing with Big Brother, her original band from The Hate and everything, because Full Tilt was doing something else in the city, or they were getting ready for a Dick Cavett show or something. But so Janis Joplin played with Big Brother. That was awesome. But in addition to Janis Joplin on the bill were Miles Davis, Paul Simon, Pacific Gas and Electric, Steppenwolf, Mountain, Johnny Winter. Janis Joplin and Dionne Warwick sang a duet of What the World Needs Now Is Love. Can you believe that? And so there I was in 6th grade. I was with a very attractive, I'm gay, but I was with a very attractive woman who's the only girl in my class that had breasts, named Doreen. So I was feeling really like, that was probably still, I was trying to be heterosexual or something.
You were top of the world of what you thought.
Right, exactly. And so I'm at this show, and because I was naive, I didn't notice that you shouldn't necessarily drink from all they were called Boda bags. They were like leather gypsy or something. Actually, that's not a good word anymore, but leather bag that, people, you could squeeze it and it would squirt water into you. The problem was that it wasn't just water.
Yeah.
So
sure.
the guy next to me who hit those bags every time they came around, they literally carried him out during the show. He became incapacitated. And so I was probably dosed. And, I do remember, I remember a bunch of things about the show, but it was an amazing experience that was not captured on camera and not captured on video or audio. So there are no recordings. There are a few pictures, apparently, but it's amazing how under-noticed that event was. And apparently it was because the publicity was bad, and but it really laid the groundwork for stuff like Live Aid and Concert for Bangladesh and Farm Aid and all. It proved it was a proof of concept for big charity gigs featuring world-class performers. So that was my very first concert.
Man, I mean, to have Miles Davis at your first concert, that is a first on the show. I got to say that. No one else has brought up Miles Davis being a part
Right.
of their concert history. That's insane. And,
Yeah.
you know, to see Johnny Winter in that day, I mean, such like a pioneer of slide guitar music, and he is just like a part of the day, like even
Right.
just to see him would have been crazy. But yeah, I mean, that sounds like proof of concept for like Live Aid,
Yeah,
for what would
exactly.
come and be a huge
Exactly.
televised event, but they just didn't record it.
Right.
That's
Exactly.
that's nuts.
Exactly. No, it's, I mean, needless to say, it's like they could have made a movie out of it and it would now be like this famous documentary, but it just didn't happen. So the next time that I went to a show that really left a deep impression on me, and I can't swear that I didn't go to any live music performances in between the Peace Festival and this, but it was the Watkins Glen Summer Jam
Wow.
in 1973. And
My
so,
God.
yeah, so I was going to go with my best friend named Tom at that point, and he had agreed to go. And then the night before, he called me up and canceled. And I had already had the fights with my parents about, that I was going to go,
And
and
negotiations had already taken place.
right, exactly. So what I did was I lied to my parents and said that I was going with my friend, which I wasn't. And I got on a Trailways bus or whatever and went up to Watkins Glen. And, again, I was like, I don't know, 15 or something. I was really young. I got there 2 days before, which turned out to be lucky because, the next day, the Grateful Dead came out for their sound check and played one of the most beautiful, completely improvised performances of their entire 30-year career. And, I, of course, did not notice that, that they were doing something special or that, it was going to be this immortal performance. I had mostly gone to the Summer Jam to see the Allman Brothers because I think Jessica and Blue Sky and whatnot were like still on the radio, and so I went to that show. I immediately lost all of my stuff. Like there was like a mudslide. I brought a sleeping bag, no, it all like turned into a sea of mud. One of the most striking things about that event was that there were only a few portisans distributed in the sea of people, So I remember that I could not pee for like an entire day. Like I was dying. And when I finally got to the portisans, there was this weird cold snap at night. And so someone set the portisans on fire. So the first time in like more than a day that I had been able to pee, I had to rush into this portisan that was on fire and take a pee.
God.
Yeah, it was amazing. I do remember thinking that the Dead's music was wonderful. The band, was the Dead, the band, the Allman Brothers. The band was also amazing. I remember them playing Stage Fright in a thunderstorm with like lightning arcing over the stage. So that was pretty amazing. I guess it was the Wall of Sound that I was seeing. And the good punchline of that whole epic story, even though I didn't have a very good time at the concert because I was too out of it and dosed over and over and dehydrated and had an aching bladder. Many years later, a couple of decades later, when the Dead asked me to help assemble a box set spanning their entire career with noted Grateful Dead scholars David Gans and Blair Jackson, that I was able to say, we should put that Watkins Glen soundcheck on this box set. And so that's how people have it now.
Yeah.
What I got to hear
Wow.
was because I remembered how amazing it was. And so and there was very little chance that it would be put out on a Dick's Picks or Dave's Picks, because Dick, who was a friend of mine, Dick Latvala, fatally, I think, underestimated the Watkins Glen show itself. So the following day, he because it was not nearly as interesting as the sound check, he thought it was bad. But if you listen to it, it's actually pretty good. Like it's fine, you know. But at that point, Dick was still alive, and so I knew that he would never put it out as a Dick's Picks. So we put it out on the box set called So Many Roads, and everybody can get it streaming now. So that was great. And then the next show that I remember going to was the show that I became a Deadhead. August 6th, August 6th, 1974. Oh, I just realized that's actually 4 years to the day after the Peace Festival at Shea Stadium. But yeah, 8674 was, you know, another legendarily one of the greatest shows of all time. And as I've told, I'm not even going to repeat the whole story because I've told it too many times, like in the movie Long Strange Trip, the documentary. But it was when Phil took a bass lead during Eyes of the World, which was the third song in the first set. You know, that was the decisive moment, you know, when I said, oh my God, you know, this is the best music I've ever heard, you know, and I made a little vow to myself, I'm going to see as much of this as I possibly can. And, you know, I made good on that promise through 1995. And saw them, you know, several hundred times. And I remember, I'm ashamed to admit this, I saw Jerry because, you know, I like moved to San Francisco in part so I could see them all the time, you know. And I remember like one night after many different JGB and Dead shows, I walked past the Stone in North Beach, and I looked in, and Jerry was on stage, and I was like, I've seen him so often this month.
Yeah,
I mean, walking, you know.
You know, everyone loves to tell their stories of seeing Jer, and there are so many people who are just like you who have seen so many shows that I'm sure they have, you're not the only person who's got a story of, you know what, like, it's fine, maybe another time. And it's just, you know, they don't tell that story. They don't tell the story of the time they didn't see Jer.
I remember that, you know, when the Dead were playing a lot around here, that you did, you know, unless you were insane and, you know, making a living from selling ice cold veggie burritos in the lot or something, you know, you would have to sort of negotiate with yourself how many shows you were willing to see, you know. I mean, and the tickets were what, you know, $10 the most. Now they're like 1,000 to get into the Sphere or something.
Yeah, right.
So you had to, like, if you were an adult, you had to, and I had, you know, practically generations of friends like give it up, but I still kept going. Like, I remember before I met Blair Jackson and David Gans, I would go to shows by myself and sometimes trip even. And, you know, I would just be like, well, I don't care if my friends aren't into it anymore. I still am, you know, and probably every Deadhead and every Fishhead has had that experience as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I've talked to, you know, people who got to see Fish in their early days that, you know, now have no problem going to a show, taking a seat, you know, you know, maybe even tripping to themselves and enjoying the experience themselves because they don't have, you know, nearly the same crew of friends they had in the 90s or something like that, you know. But what, you know, you talked a little bit about the lot scene, like in the early 70s, you know, in the 74 and, you know, those types of years. What's the scene around Dead shows like? What's it like to be around Deadheads?
Well, okay. Roosevelt Stadium was a pit, you know, it was awful. But on 8674, the Deadhead, you know, it was the wall of sound, but Phil also had his quad bass. so he could move his bass notes around the arena in 3 dimensions. Like, oh, they're coming from over there. Oh, they're coming from over there. Like it was awesome. And then after the show, which if you look at the set list, it was pretty freaking amazing with like a plain scarlet plain sandwich or whatever. Like I remember talking with my friends, like, instead of saying like, oh, well, they should have played blah, 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 we were like trying to figure out what they didn't play,
Yeah.
And one thing that I definitely remember is that one of the things that I saw for the first time at Roosevelt Stadium on that day was people selling bootleg vinyl out of the back of their cars. So that was the first time I saw Grateful Dead bootlegs, actually. And there were, there were a couple of classic bootlegs. I forget what they were, but so people were selling bootleg vinyl. There was a lot of buzz around the Mafia was really getting into bootlegging the Dead back then. So like when Wake of the Flood came out, there were these fake Mafia pressings, all this stuff.
Yeah.
But the Deadhead scene to me seemed to be slightly rough. There were a lot of bikers around. Now that the words Grateful Dead have become associated with dancing bears and Jer Bear and tie-dye and hearts and, no. The Grateful Dead, the phrase Grateful Dead, in 1974, it was supposed to scare the normies,
Yeah.
And so, like people who didn't know what their music was like would think that it was like some kind of death metal band, or whatever. Yeah. But so it was pretty rough, which gets into, by the way, my next significant concert experience, which happened 2 nights later after August 6, 1970. I can't believe I had the stamina. I went back to Roosevelt Stadium to see Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young for the first time. Yeah. And it happened to be the night that Nixon resigned for doing much less than Donald Trump has. Anyway, but so I remember, like, the scene at the stadium was not good. Like there was some kind of crazy dark energy going through the crowd. Maybe it was because of the Nixon stuff, but so at some point Graham comes out and says, and I still hear it in my head, Nixon's resigned, and this like this roar, it's like feral roar, like, came from 1,000, alcohol breathing mouths.
Right.
And then Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young came out to play their acoustic set in the middle of the show. That's what they would do. And of course, that was what I was most looking forward to, because they were, Neil and Stephen were badass in the electric jams, but the acoustic set was what they were known for. And as soon as they come out, David Crosby, who was my favorite one for various reasons, and ended up becoming a really good friend of mine years later, somebody hit him on the head with a bottle from the audience. It was there, bam! Oh. And then these bottles started raining down on the band. And so they left the stage.
Man.
It was ugly, and I was tripping, of course. I think it was maybe the first time I ever took acid at a concert, or on purpose.
Yeah, right.
And I was with my best friend, who typically I had a crush on, but he was with his girlfriend and they were tripping too. So they spent the entire evening like cuddling each other and talking and ignoring me and, and all that. So nightmare. I was like, it was a nightmare. I literally had, thoughts of self-harm during that show. But what saved my cosmic ass was that after CSNY refused to come out to do an acoustic show, Neil came out with his electric and sang a song called Don't Be Denied, which is like one of the heaviest songs that he ever recorded. And it's very dark, but very redemptive. And it was the most intense version. And I am not exaggerating, because flash forward like 20 years or whatever, I'm in a hotel room with Crosby, Stills, and Nash, and
Wow.
we're planning their box set CSN, which came out in the early 90s or whatever. And so there was going to be 2 discs and then a 3rd disc of rarities. And so I said, well, if we have it, we should get the Don't Be Denied from Roosevelt Stadium, August 8th, 1974. And Joel Bernstein, who was Neil's archivist and also Joni Mitchell's archivist, said, oh my God, that was the best performance of that ever. But unfortunately, the tape ran out halfway through.
Oh my God.
So we don't have a complete soundboard. So if anybody out there has an audience tape of CSNY August 8th, 1974 at Roosevelt Stadium, please leak it. Because it was incredible performance. So that wasn't a good time, but I ended up seeing CSNY actually a couple weeks later, I think, with the Beach Boys or whatever, at Roosevelt Raceway, which is on Long Island. This often causes confusion among tape heads, and that was like a more mellow experience.
Less bottles.
Yes, exactly, less bottles. But yeah, I mean, I pretty much, Neil Young, like, I never diss him because he did magic. He turned Altamont into Woodstock or something, by playing this really intense song. Yeah.
Yeah, on a super intense night. And it sounds like, I mean, like, artists are still dealing with that today. I think that there was a video I saw literally 2 days ago of Adele having to kind of shut someone down in her audience who's yelling something for Trump or something. And, she's got to stop the show and be like, if you're going to do that, get out of here. And then the crowd roars. And then there's this weird political moment in the crowd. And, yeah, you kind of have to, you have to be a performer that is able to speak to that. But yeah, I mean, I'm sure that was a special and charged performance, especially who Neil is and was in that time.
Right.
I'm sure there was a lot of emotion that went into that.
Yeah, and his album, I forget if it was out by then or not, but his album On the Beach was basically it was the blonde on blonde of the Nixon era, more or less. It was the great dark masterpiece of the Nixon Watergate era. So that stuff was certainly on his mind. Yeah, but it's one thing that has changed since then that makes the concert experience worse, I think, is that people are so used to just listening to, or watching movies at home where they can talk. And so people just talk. And especially if they're slightly drunk, I don't know if you've noticed, but there's something about alcohol that encourages people to talk voluminously. So now you just have people who pretend that they're seeing the show in their living room. And, I always want to say, like, do you know that what you're saying is so much less important to me than the music that the band is playing,
Oh, yeah. And I've been the guy that shushes people before. And then, if you're shushing or the person who's drunk, then it's like, now we got to talk about how I shushed you. And we got to,
Exactly.
and now we were talking about the talking. And yeah, and it happens at nearly every show. And it's like almost like a rarity when you can watch a performer shut a crowd up because they're so amazing,
Right.
It takes a lot, to really lock people in. Yeah.
Definitely. So I have various other stories to tell. Do you want to hear the worst performance I ever saw?
I really would. Yeah.
Okay. Let me preface this by saying I am not insulting this band or its fans. I have enjoyed many of their records. I know that they were basically up to something good, but when at the last minute, a band called Supergrass was substituted by a band called Low, opening up for Radiohead at Madison Square Garden, I saw the most embarrassing thing that I ever saw a band do, which was the lead guitarist for Low, and asked for the lights to come down even more than they were, because of course it was already, Madison Square Garden dark.
Right.
So they start turning the lights off, and he's like, no, those lights too. And so they're switching off the hall lights, right? And so then they're switching off like the exit signs, like until it was absolutely pitch dark. And
Yeah.
and he was being really annoying, like, and people were starting to get unhappy, like
Right.
people were starting to talk. It was going on for so long that
It's
people are
like, we
starting
get
to,
it.
and then you hear him say into the microphone, "Oh, God damn it, I can't see my fingers." So, oh, that
Which,
was
if this was a Steve Martin bit, amazing.
right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
Incredible.
yeah.
But
So that wasn't too good.
oh God.
Yeah. Then the next show that I saw that, or well, I mean, there were many, but for instance, I saw, for punk fans, I saw the Clash and the Dead Kennedys play in a very small place 3 blocks from where I'm sitting, San Francisco, Kezar Fieldhouse. Loudest concert I ever saw. My head rang for a week. Serious mosh pit, you know. But so
Yeah.
that was like, I feel like I saw punk like in its full raging glory at that show. It wasn't my trip yet. I got into it later. Then I had an incredible experience seeing the Talking Heads big band, so the band from Stop
Mm,
Making Sense, which just came out again, um,
yeah.
with Black Uhuru opening that had Sly and Robbie on bass and drums. Sly and Robbie were, like the rhythm section of reggae, basically. And right before the concert started, this was at what's now called Bill Graham Auditorium in San Francisco. Right before the concert started, this young lesbian who we didn't even really know dropped a huge sack of mushrooms at our feet and said, "Oh, just have as many as you want." So we started eating them like potato chips, like we were really not, controlling our dose. And I
Yeah.
remember, like, mushrooms can kick in pretty fast if you eat enough of them. And I remember, like, Sly and Robbie started playing, and they were doing live dub mixing. You know what that is, right?
Oh
Where
yeah.
they're like fading the instruments in and out. And
Right.
I remember my friend who I went with, like, we were obviously like really getting up really fast, and the music was unbelievable. And he turned to me with wild eyes. He said, "Electric Babylon, man." Whoa. And then Talking Heads came out, and Tom Tom Club actually played a set within the Talking Heads set,
Very
which was
cool.
cool. Yeah. And the moment that I sort of had, what Zen people call Satori, or a moment of illumination, was they were singing a David Byrne song from the album Catherine Wheel called Big Business. And I had never understood what the following lines meant until that moment. David Byrne sings in the song, which didn't make much sense in the, like, hearing it sung at home in the studio. But he's saying, and we go boom, 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 and that's the way we live. And in a great big room, and that's the way we live. And it was like, oh
Yeah.
my God, like, I'm here, like, this is it. Like, it was a moment of being fully and absolutely present at a show. And I had those moments at Dead shows too, and Fish shows later.
Wow. Yeah,
Yeah,
I mean, in that song particularly, yeah, they kind of snap you out of whatever you're like, and go boom, 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 those big,
right,
flashes from the band and everything. Yeah, all of a sudden
right,
you're you're at attention.
right. And he was speaking to the living reality of the present moment,
Yeah.
and that was amazing. And then, am I going through these too quickly, or
I literally do. I have a million questions about every single one of these shows that we can't
okay,
possibly do. So
okay,
I mean, I'm just gonna
feel
have to
free to
have you
ask.
to keep rolling. Yeah.
Okay, all right, okay. So then, the next show that seems obvious to talk about was I saw Fish at the Great American Music Hall on October 18th, 1991. And I went because, I'll be honest, I went because I've been seeing ads for this stupid band that spelled it wrong, Phish, at the wetlands, And every time I saw that word, like in the Village Voice or whatever, I thought, fish, these stupid fucking hippies, And so, but everyone's like, you got to see Fish. You got to see, they're the next Grateful Dead. They're the next Grateful Dead. So when Fish came to the Great American, where the Deadhead, of course, played one of the greatest shows of their entire career in 1975, later released as One from the Vault. So I go there, and not only was it unbelievable, not only was my future husband probably 20 yards away from me in the crowd, but we didn't meet yet, and we would not meet for a couple of years, but he was there too.
Wow.
It was an amazing show, especially because apparently the children of Ernie Stiles, who was like Trey's composition coach or whatever, teacher, was there at the show. And there was just such a variety of music, like everything from, I think I remember Brother seemed amazing. They opened the second set with Brother. And I remember distinctly thinking, this is the last time I'll ever see these guys in such a small venue, because they're too good. Like the next time I see them, it'll probably be Oakland Coliseum, and maybe it was, well, it wasn't Oakland Coliseum. I'll tell you when the next time I saw them was, but it was just so good. I couldn't believe it. And I thought, like, wow, these guys really have and they sang I think they sang a bluegrass thing, or maybe it was just possum or whatever. But, it was great. And there was the good energy. And that was also, 1991, that was a sad time to be a Deadhead, because Brent had died. I had loved Brent. I never liked Vince as much, sorry. And so for me, the magic kind of went out of the Dead after Brent died. Yes, there were good shows. Yes, I went on tour anyway. Yes, there were some really good jams, but it never really came together for me after Brent died. So to see a band that was like young, just getting their first waves of, national notice, the rumor mill that they were the next Grateful Dead that was around. And so I thought, wow, these guys are amazing, And so then a couple of years later, in 1994, I was a freelance journalist, and I was assigned to do a story on the disco revival, which I didn't want to do, but I needed the money. And so right at that moment, I met in email my future husband, who wrote to me because he saw an online posting and said, "Are you the guy who used to review Grateful Dead shows?" Yes, I am. And gay Deadheads were very rare. Like now there's like, a whole seating section of queer Deadheads. But,
Right.
I was actually the first gay Deadhead to come out in print in an article in Relics. And,
wow.
And people, sorry.
That's not a title I would have ever known to attribute to you. I mean, that's what that's crazy.
Well, the interesting thing is that, now it's like I'll see young Deadheads on Facebook or whatever saying like, "Oh, who cares if anyone's gay? It's all cool." Well, it wasn't all cool in the early 90s at all. And
Hell's Angels weren't cool about that, or
no, they were not mellow about that. And something that most people don't know is that the longtime manager of the Grateful Dead, like for the Europe 72 tour, John McIntyre, was closeted. And I know that because he told me. And so it was not at all cool to be openly gay in the Dead scene. Pretty late, even after other people were cool. But so anyway, Keith said that my future husband said that he was just about to go on tour with Fish and invited me along with his friends. and that was like going to be our first dates. Like
Wow.
our first dates were going on tour with Fish. And so I wrote to the newspaper that hired me to do the disco revival thing. And I said, wouldn't you rather have a piece on the next Grateful Dead?
Yeah.
So what's funny is I almost got really busted on that tour because in Santa Barbara, we're going in and they had like frat and sorority security or something like that. So this young girl goes into my socks, like she's literally like reaching down into my socks, where, by the way, she found some weed. And and she immediately becomes hysterical. Officer, come over here. And so this guy comes over and he's wearing mirrored sunglasses, and it's at night. And
One of those guys.
right, one of those guys. And so he says, driver's license. And I said, I don't have a driver's license, but I do have an ID card. I don't know how to drive. I still don't. So he looks at the ID card and he looks at me, and he looks at the card, and he looks at me, and he says, medical problem? So he banned me from going into the show, but I snuck in through another door anyway.
Right.
And so that's right.
Of course.
But then, so it was the moment that I got Fish in the same way that I got in the Dead at Roosevelt Stadium was during Reba at Spreckles Theater on December 18th, 1994. And Trey was doing these, it was very quiet jamming with almost like these fluttering bird sounds from his guitar. And I was very impressed by the command of dynamics that Fish had, which was the same deal that the Dead had. Like, they didn't, almost every band that you see, they play at a pretty consistent volume level, but the Dead and Fish loved bringing the dynamic range down to a very quiet thing. And so that happened during Reba. And I had like tears in my eyes. It was like so beautiful. Yeah. And
yeah, I mean, with that sort of pass off as it ended up being, it sounds like you were pretty pro Fish from the moment you saw them, or maybe you thought they were dorks at first and then you saw them live and then you're like, wow, these are impressive dorks maybe. But was that sort of, I mean, amongst your Deadhead friends, were people accepting them and going to the shows, or were there people who were like, I can't believe you're going to see these guys so often? Or
yeah, there was definitely both. One of the things that helped me get into Fish was when David Schenk and I were writing Skeleton Key, I got in touch with Tom Marshall, the lyricist for Fish. And I would go so far as to say the lyricist of the better Fish lyrics. Anyway, I'm a little controversial about certain things about Fish, but as I was with the Dead, But in any case, so I got in touch with him, and I asked him if he would give me an interview, and he said that he would. But over email. And so I sent him a bunch of questions, and he sent me back answers that were so surreal and so imaginative that it was like, this guy is a genius, and he also turned out to be a really nice guy, and I met him. And also during that first tour with Spreckles and whatnot, I did meet John and Mike, who just would come out. I mean, that was when they would come out to hang out with the audience after the show. Like, it wasn't a big thing, they were just there. And they were such nice guys. And Fishman was hilarious. He said that there's an album, you know who Brian Eno is, right? And
yes.
Yeah. Right. So there's a Frippin' Eno album called No Pussyfooting. And it's like, really heavy duty ambient loops or whatever. And with a track called Swastika Girls, of all things.
Unbelievable.
And, yeah. And Fishman said, so sometimes that album was so heavy, sometimes I would just take the cover of the album and just like put it on my desk and look at it and say, whoa. Wow, you know, these guys are great, and I like that they weren't putting on any airs. They were very
Yeah.
hardworking. They rehearsed a lot, which the Dead didn't do so much often. And they just seem like mensches, as they say in Yiddish, real human beings. And so yeah, I got into them right away. And then what was funny was that Tom and I became friends, but then Fish became like super famous, and he sort of drifted away, and then I became semi-famous because of my book, so I sort of drifted away, and we didn't really connect until I went to see the Ghosts of the Forest show
Yeah.
at the Greek, and I see Tom, and he's a very good-looking big guy, and I thought, oh, there's Tom, but I bet he probably doesn't even remember my name. And then like a minute later, I'm like getting this big bear hug, and it's Tom. He's like, Steve, I've missed you. So that was cool. And through that meeting, we by that point I was very good friends with David Crosby, and we arranged to do a podcast with David Crosby for Osiris Media, and that podcast was called Freak Flag Flying. It was 8 episodes, 6 with Cross. Very, very, very in-depth, fascinating conversations unfolding over the course of several months, really. But anybody who wants to know who David Crosby really was and what his music was really about should listen to Freak Flag Flying, and we put a bunch of rare music in the soundtrack and stuff. So that wouldn't have happened if I hadn't met Tom years before.
Yeah, I mean, Tom is instrumental in this podcast happening. This is, a part of Osiris, and I got to interview him, and yeah, it's very cool how imaginative he is in conversation just alone. I mean, we were just goofing around, just talking about some of the shows that he's seen, and he's just such a, like you said, he's a mensch. He's such a good human to have around, and he really asks no questions about this podcast. He's just like, let her rip, buddy.
Well, that's great.
And I appreciate it.
Well, that's cool. Tom, thank you. I love you. You've been a really good pal.
and
yeah,
and I'm sure he hasn't listened to not one episode of the. No, it's maybe he's listened to a couple, but do you? So I don't know that we've gotten to your best show ever, the best concert you ever saw in your life. Is there one singular?
I mean, the non-Dead show that was the best concert I ever saw was that Talking Head show that we talked about.
Oh yeah,
with Fucker. But I'll tell you the show that sort of made the deepest impression on me. I can't swear that it was the absolutely best. It's not necessarily one of my top 5 Grateful Dead shows of all time, but it was Cleveland Music Hall in when was that? 78. November 20th, 1978, I think. Yeah. And several things made it unusual and great. One was that, I was tripping on superb LSD. It was called Red Dragon, which was, there were 2 sort of product lines at the time, Red Dragon and Green Dragon. And it was just really powerful, really clean LSD. I confess now, I hope the statute of limitations has passed. It was the only time I ever sold LSD to people. I sold about, I think 100 hits or so. I was a student at Oberlin, with that famous liberal enclave in Ohio. And so, at least 100 people came up to see the Dead. There were a lot of Deadheads there. And and it was very small, very, very small venue. But what really made it special, the whole thing was great, but what really made it special was that for the only time ever, I think, the Dead came out and opened the second set with Drums in Space. So Billy and Mickey just came out and started playing. And we actually didn't know in the audience, was the second set starting? Like, what's happening? And then, Jerry and Phil came wandering out and they start playing too. And they play a jam that eventually goes into Jackaroo. But it was wild. It was as if they were playing a house concert and just sort of wandering back into the living room, to pick up their guitars and whatever. And the main thing that got to me about that show and rewired my brain forever, really, was that they jammed from song to song all the way through the second set. So, like, after the play-in, what is it? Or they go back into the play-in reprise after something. They also played "If I Had the World to Give." The jam, they only played it, I think, twice in their whole career. The jam out of "If I Had the World to Give" is one of the heaviest things you'll ever hear. It's apocalyptic, and especially if you like slide guitar, because I believe both Jerry and Bob are playing slide guitar, and it'll peel the skin off your skull. It's unbelievable. But what blew my mind was that because they kept jamming from song to song, the individual compositions were like islands in this sea of music that, like, you would just go back into the sea, once you got off the island. So, and they were so together in their collective improvisation that it was like, being watching this group mind. It was like listening to God thinking to himself, more or less.
Yeah. Wow.
And you said something on a recent podcast that you appeared on, where you talked about how certain moments at Dead shows and other shows, Fish shows, maybe you were talking, would allow an opportunity for reflection and meditation and course correction in your life, in a way. Like, you would come to some realization about, your work or, your relationships or whatever. And that those jam-oriented shows created a space where, even though from the outside it looks like, oh, it's a bunch of people dancing together in a collective whatever, it actually allows for a deep solitude, because you can reflect on the music and come to profound silent realizations. And that was going on in a big way at Cleveland Music Hall. And so that was really the moment when the Dead were doing something that no other band did as well ever. And, the setting and the audience and everything, it was another perfect moment. And so,
I think if you're someone who is interested in finding that sort of a moment at a show, that Drums in Space, you said that, that was never a beer run for you, or never a bathroom run for you. Yeah, that's a great moment for some private solitude, thought to yourself meditation. And, there's a lot of, while there are probably a lot of conversations going on around you, especially now, you talked about that now being a huge part of the show, and it is, especially during that part of a show. But yeah, I mean, the moments that were way out to sea, like you said, or the moments that get, really, really ambient, for me, are super confident moments of creation that I feel like really lucky to be in the room for. And so for me, it's like trying to connect to that, because I know that I'd like to achieve that, I guess, or something along those lines. But no matter what, yeah, I love those moments where they can. You were talking about what the Dead and Fish does, bringing volume down. Those are like some of the most powerful moments of the show, or the shows that I've seen, at least. And I like yearn for that at the show. I love like dancing with my friends, and like a big white light peak is really fun, and watching really impressive musicianship when someone's ripping a solo, whether it's on piano or guitar or something, is always super impressive to watch. And I also am going for that. But those moments are kind of my what I'm seeking, at least. And
I feel you. And something an experience that I used to have a lot of shows, is feeling that by being there at that moment, it was the one place on earth that you would want to be at that moment. Like, no matter where you were, like, okay, I want to be standing in front of Jerry Garcia when the Grateful Dead goes into Scarlet Begonias to open the second set. Like, you know,
Yeah.
it was perfect to be where you were, which was great. Yeah.
In a big, big room.
Yeah, exactly.
So that was my conversation with Steve. I, you really can't get a better conversation about live music than you can with Steve. His thoughts around the reason people talk at shows now is because we can watch shows in our living room and just talk with our friends, and so now we just treat that live music experience similarly, is to me the most brilliant. I'm like, of course that's why. You know, I thought it was just tall boy Modelo's, but really it's how we've been conditioned to watch shows. And what a more beautiful way to think about seeing concerts, as you know, like going to see the Grateful Dead. This is you seeing the Grateful Dead. There's not a ton of footage out for you to just rate in your living room and compare to other footage that you see. This conversation, I truly, you know, there's a point in it where I'm like, I wish I could ask 1,000 questions about every single thing that we've talked about. That's so true. Just listening back to it now, there could be a separate episode about every concert that he brings up. And I was lucky to get to chat with him. And so I really hope you guys enjoyed this episode. I really hope you guys enjoyed this season. Like I said before, thank you so much for any support that's been given. If you've subscribed, if you've given it 5 stars, if you wrote a nice review, all that stuff. Thank you guys so much for doing it. Season 4 will be coming out very soon. But until next time, guys, have a great show.